Everyone can see my slides? Awesome. Okay, let me get that out of the way. Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this year's SSE Presidential Symposium, Navigating Uncertainty, Individual Resilience, and Collective Action in Evolutionary Biology. I'm Regina Bauckham, the SSE President. I'm really glad that you're here with us. I suspect many of us, especially researchers within the US, have arrived at this meeting carrying some uncertainty. So questions about funding, about research continuity, questions about how to support students, postdocs, and early career colleagues during a time that feels really unpredictable. Many of us are seeing delayed proposal decisions, changing federal priorities, and real concerns about sustaining research programs. Many people are wondering what this moment means for the future of evolutionary biology. So uncertainty is not new to science, but this moment feels important enough that it seemed worth creating a space to think together about how we respond. So as I talked with colleagues over the last year and a half, I kept hearing the same kinds of questions. How do we sustain our research programs if funding becomes less reliable? How do we support trainees and early career scientists through uncertainty? What can departments, universities, and societies do to help? And just as importantly, how do we continue doing meaningful science without becoming overwhelmed by instability? These are practical questions, but they're also personal ones. They shape how we mentor, how we plan, and how we imagine the future. So as I thought about this symposium, it became clear to me that uncertainty is happening at more than one level. There's big picture questions about funding, institutions, and the future of science, but there's also very personal questions about resilience, motivation, and how we keep moving forward. It seemed important to me to make space for both. So today's symposium has two linked sessions. The first, which you're here for now, focuses on the collective. What can our community do? The second focuses on the individual. How do we respond in ways that are constructive, sustainable, and grounded? For our first session, I invited a group of people I think of as sense makers, so past SSE presidents and leaders in the field. I invited them because they bring experience, perspective, and a long view of our discipline. I asked each person to do something very specific, not simply comment on the moment, but offer a practical idea that might help us move forward. You'll hear ideas about supporting trainees, research programs, rethinking evaluation, strengthening networks, and thinking creatively about the resources we have available to us. We're very fortunate to be joined by Pro Manna, Ruth Shaw, Scott Edwards, Emily Josephs, and Alison Davis Rabosky. Unfortunately, Joseph Graves couldn't join us today. I want to say this clearly in this introduction. I hope today's conversation is not just focused on the senior academic perspective. Some of the hardest parts of this moment are being felt most strongly by students, postdocs, and early career scientists. I hope this becomes a conversation that happens across career stages. Even the best structural ideas that we can come up with together do not fully answer the personal side of uncertainty. How do we stay focused when things are so uncertain? How do we avoid burnout when we're trying to figure out what to do? How do we continue to move forward when the future feels less predictable? That's why the second session shifts to the individual. Later today, we'll be joined by leadership coach Nelia Viveiros for an interactive workshop focused on resilience, clarity, and practical tools for navigating uncertainty. My hope is that people leave today with something useful, a practical idea, a new perspective, or maybe just a feeling that we're not navigating this moment alone. Thank you for being here, and thank you especially to our speakers for helping us think carefully and constructively about this moment. So with that, we're going to begin. And just so everyone knows, we have a lineup of 5-minute lightning talks. Each speaker will give their talk, and then at the end of the symposium, we'll do a brief Q&A or a Q&A where we hope that people in the audience will ask questions and we'll have a constructive dialogue. We might, if we're on time, have a shorter Q&A at about 9:20, but we'll let you know if that happens. So with that, I'm going to unshare and we can begin. Okay. First up is Pro.
Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Pro, and I serve on Graduate Student Advisory Council for SSE. And today I want to share what we have been hearing from trainees, grad students, postdocs on funding climate and their experiences, and what it tells us about building resilient scientific communities right now. So we ran a community check-in to listen to trainees directly. We got 20 responses from grad student and postdocs in nearly equal manner from 4 different countries. People mentioned they're impacted not just through delayed research timelines, but or travel limitations, but through stress, instability, career uncertainty, and questions about whether they can continue to imagine a future in science. Nearly all respondents described elevated stress and uncertainty around long-term career planning. Many reported hiring freezes, unstable contracts, delayed research progress, and loss of travel or conference opportunities. But one thing that stood out to me is that trainees are trainees are reading the same headlines as everyone else is, but they are carrying the consequence in very immediate manner. And the responses also revealed something deeper than funding concerns alone. Many trainees described losing confidence in their ability to plan ahead, mentor undergrads, or even remain optimistic about staying in academia. They described mentoring decisions, identity, isolation, and these were not isolated responses. So when we asked what we can actually do better to help them, the answers were surprisingly practical and community-oriented. People asked for better resource sharing, funding databases, fellowship lists, application strategies, and information about opportunities outside traditional pathways. Many also asked for stronger advocacy and representation, especially around hiring expectations, tenure criteria, and institutional policies that maybe still assume a much more stable funding environment. And several respondents asked for something very simple: acknowledgement. Just recognizing that this is an unusually difficult moment for everyone and creating a space where trainees can talk about it very honestly would help, because resilient science cannot rely solely on individual endurance. And to the audience in this room, most of you have more power than you realize. First, acknowledge. Acknowledge the moment. One of the most repeated requests we got was simply for senior colleagues not to minimize what trainees are experiencing. Second, mentor for now, not for then. The academic job market many trainees are entering is very different than one previous generation trained in. Third, use your reach. Share opportunities outside your network. Write the letter. Recommend someone very loudly. And fourth, push your institutions on hiring criteria, tenure clocks, conference accessibility, and policies that shape who is actually will be able to remain in science. Small actions from people with institutional power meaningfully change what trainees are able to carry. And none of this requires grant money. It requires noticing and using the leverage you already have. So to end, if we want science to remain innovative, collaborative, and inclusive during these uncertain times, we have to actively invest in people who are most exposed to instability: the trainees, the grad students, the postdocs. Because listening to trainees is not separate from strengthening the science. It is part of strengthening the science. And with that, I would like to thank SSE for giving me the chance to talk on behalf of the grad students and postdocs. And I'm happy to hear what other people also think.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pro. Next up, we have Mohamed Noor, who's joining us via video.
Hello, my name is Mohamed Noor, and I served as SSE president in 2014. Huge honor. Over the past 7 years, I've become more deeply involved in university administration, and I currently serve as my university's executive vice provost. So that's the perspective I'm going to be bringing to you today. It is a very, very different world than what it was in 2014. Back then, we were debating the role of massive open online courses like MOOCs. SSE was experimenting with crowdsourcing recordings of conference talks. It doesn't feel like a decade ago, it feels like it was another century. The last few years have been tough. Many of us feel that the good work we've done to help people has been dismantled. At times, it feels like we've been pitted against each other through false allegations and targeted threats that disproportionately affect some members of our community. It helps to separate the issues. Some involve threats to inclusive excellence in community. Others may involve funding, our trainees, our international students, or broader perceptions of academia. But one of the least recognized threats right now is falling into despair. It's okay to feel angry, it's okay to feel stressed, but only if that energy guides you and doesn't stall you. Wallowing isn't useful. My first and most important advice is please don't fall into despair. Get help, lean on family and friends, get professional support. Speaking personally, I use university counseling resources and outside coaches pretty regularly. If you find a good match, it is a game changer. I speak to my coach literally every other week, sometimes for a big picture perspective, and sometimes just for help crafting a difficult email. You don't have to carry all of this alone. Second, get good information directly from informed sources. Go to sessions hosted by your Office of Research or your Office of Visa Services and ask questions. If they're not offering forums, suggest that they do. Colleagues often come to me furious about something that just happened, only to learn that it was half the story and the other half changes everything. Also, when you speak with these groups, try to avoid asking about hypotheticals. These offices right now are inundated. Focus on what has happened and what is very likely to happen next. And remember, these folks, they're people too, and they're trying their best to help us. Third, ask directly for help. If you can't travel somewhere essential to your research or a grant is pulled at a critical moment, talk to your dean. Ask what options exist. Is a tenure clock extension possible? Maybe bridge funding, even a few $1,000s. If you don't ask, you may be leaving a workable solution on the table. And one final thought. Let's crowdsource useful resources like these and not just share rage bait. What actually helped your trainees or junior faculty navigate the past year? What options did you discover that others might not know about? SSE has always been a community that supports its members. This is another moment to do that deliberately. To all of you, please don't lose hope. We will get through this, but not if we turn on each other or on our institutions. Help your university leaders help you. Many of us study adaptation. Let's take time to practice it now. Thank you all for your time.
Okay, that was excellent. We have a couple of minutes, so we're going to wait until 9:15 to hear from Ruth Shaw. For those of you who might have come in a little bit late, just an update that we are going to have potentially Q&A starting at 9:20. Definitely, we're going to have Q&A starting at 9:40, where it'll be kind of like a panel. What we'll do is if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll go through and call on you. But you're also welcome to put questions into the chat, and Jacob, our tech assistant, will call out those questions from the chat. Okay, so we will start back up in about 1 minute and possibly have a short Q&A at 9:20.
So I see it's 9:15. I'll go ahead and start. Great. I've chosen to focus my comments on redoubling our commitment to our individual and collective responsibility to assess the science that's proposed and produced on the direct evidence of its merits. I hasten to acknowledge that our work as reviewers of papers and grant proposals and editors has always drawn on this commitment. Having served in all these roles, I want to register here that it has made me enormously proud of our whole community to witness how thoughtfully and usually constructively we carry out that important work. And I also want to highlight that this is likewise abundantly true of program officers at NSF, like Sam Shiner, from whom we heard just an hour ago. With that, I'll start sharing my slides. Here's my brief outline. I want to talk first about recent trends toward reliance on metrics of scholarly work, and then more recent efforts to counter the influence of metrics and give a few recommendations of my own. Let's see, I should do presentation mode. I want to thank senior colleagues who responded thoughtfully and extensively to my queries on this topic, and also those who have envisioned more responsible assessment of scholarly work and already substantially advanced this project. And I'll thank Gina Balcom, too, for inviting me to give some thoughts here. So metrics have really grown, as you all are aware, I'm sure, to hold power over scholars' academic careers. And I've listed a few of those metrics here. There are others, of course. I want to say that when I finished my PhD in 1983, none of these metrics were so prominent nearly as much as they are today. They have really accelerated exponentially to the strong influence they hold today. I think early career scholars may just not be aware that this is a recent phenomenon. This situation concerns me and many others because I feel it deters pursuit of scholarly work that would be meaningful, but is risky or especially time-consuming, or just not in the current fashion, or at least as fashion is perceived, or is in less populated subfields. And here I want to acknowledge that there strong progress has been made on scholarly assessment, for example, through anonymous peer review of manuscripts submitted to journals. But even more so, here I have just given a listing of some of the efforts that are much more expansive toward responsible research assessment. And in particular, the one here at the top is the Declaration of Research Assessment that was made in 2012 already. That's quite some time ago, and has now been built out into a very extensive effort to guide responsible research assessment. I urge you to consult these websites for information on these efforts, and in particular, I encourage you to look at this more extensive paper, which considers the efforts that are being made in particular countries, and it highlights that the adoption of the declaration, DORA here, has been made in various European countries, also Canada. And so here in the US, which is my vantage point, we are lagging behind on adopting these processes. So I'm very heartened to learn that the situation in Europe and Canada has shifted dramatically away from reliance on simplistic metrics. So I'll turn to my own thoughts, my recommendations. So to senior members of our community, I'll just say perhaps you're already doing these things, and if so, kudos to you, but I will urge you when commenting on candidates for scholarly positions, whether hiring or promotion, writing outside letters or serving on committees within your institutions, strive to understand candidates' work, read at least one paper closely, and offer your thoughts about its caliber, including how and why it matters, why it's significant. And talk with others to urge them similarly. Many of our colleagues readily agree that no metric is an adequate substitute for reading a paper to assess the work it reports. Many, nevertheless, use metrics because they consider this the norm. But as a community, we can change the norm, and that process is underway already in some countries. For early career scholars, I'll just urge you to discuss this subject with your peers and also with those more senior, and contribute your ideas to improving processes for responsible review of scholarly accomplishment. And for all in our community, I urge you to submit your manuscripts to society journals. You will benefit from high standard of review. And then when your work appears in those journals, you will be contributing to society efforts to support evolutionists and evolutionary study. And be aware of these projects toward direct assessment of scholarly activity from local to global. I'm confident that these efforts can break the influence of simplistic metrics. So please learn about these efforts and support those projects. I want to acknowledge that we're all short on time, and there is the question, how can we add anything to our slates? But in my experience, much work along these lines can readily be built into our regular practices. And I'll just conclude by saying, as a collective project, this will gratify and inspire all of us to take back the responsibility of assessing scholarly work in evolution. So thanks for this time.
Awesome. Thank you, Ruth. Okay, so we have about 3 minutes or maybe 2.5 minutes. Does anyone have a quick question for either Pro or Ruth? I see a lot of clapping. Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions and I'll call on you. Everyone's saving their questions to the end. That's what's happening right now.
Fair enough.
Everyone's taking studious notes.
Well, just a comment on Ruth's talk. I mean, you pointed to a really important problem, and it's this focus on the top journals, and it's really, really detrimental. So thank you for bringing up those points, and something that we all can do to notify our tenure and promotion committees of this really serious problem.
Thanks so much, Scott. Appreciate that endorsement.
We've got a comment in the chat that says, I agree with more focus on society journals versus for-profit entities. I agree too. Scott, do you want to go ahead and start sharing?
Great. Can everyone see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Regina, for inviting us and bringing this symposium together. It's very, very timely. And yeah, my name is Scott Edwards. I was past president of SSE back in 2012. And, the society has really been my bedrock in my community for most of my career. And, just as background, I I study the evolution of birds. I use DNA techniques to look at how they've evolved and how they're related to each other. And I say that simply to indicate that I come to this discussion as someone who's really just driven by curiosity science. I'm not out there to cure cancer. And I often wonder, who cares about what I do? I mean, I know my colleagues care, but I often wonder how broader society cares. And that I think has motivated a lot of the points in my talk. And so, one thing that we really have, our sort of ace of spades as a community, is that the public loves natural history. They love biodiversity. If you think about where the public flocks to it when they flock to scientists, I think of people like Jane Goodall, David Attenborough. I mean, they're not molecular biologists in this community. We have a huge strength in that we are studying one of just the most fascinating topic you could imagine. Now, the weakness is that evolutionary biology is often, it's just not understood by the public, and it's often considered irrelevant to biomedicine and society. I think, molecular biology still has this hegemony over how we think about exact science, what's really impactful science, what's going to really improve society. For whatever reason, evolutionary approaches are often not considered or deemed very, very indirect. So we have to capitalize on our strengths in terms of engaging the public and educating them as to the importance of evolutionary biology. And I think all of us know that evolution is absolutely essential for lots of topics of importance to human society, agriculture, biomedicine. I mean, there's amazing ways in which evolution is being used to put together new immune defenses, to study cancer evolution. And we have to meet the public halfway in this sense. We have to show them how evolution is important for these activities that are perceived, to be more important to society. That's the great aspect of evolution, is it covers so many different topics and is relevant to so many endeavors. And I think we have to meet them halfway, combine just the general curiosity about life on Earth with demonstrating that it's a really important aspect of how we can survive it and thrive. Now, public outreach is a really important aspect of everything that we do, and I really believe strongly that at every level, from graduate students, postdocs, early career researchers, we need to get out there and tell the public about what we do and why we love it so much. To the extent that we don't connect with the public, that's a death knell to science. It's, the public, we can't expect them to support activities that they don't understand or they don't know about. And so taking every opportunity you can to connect with people and, not necessarily just folks in urban environments. This, by the way, is my colleague Jingmai O'Connor, who is describing this amazing bird fossil, Archaeopteryx, which was a new specimen was sent to the Field Museum. It doesn't, we have to just connect with the public, and it doesn't have to be just urban audiences. I think it's very important that we try to connect with rural audiences as well. And of course, education and the process of teaching is really our bedrock as scientists. And I take great solace in just being able to teach students. I'll be honest. I mean, teaching is very much a form of propaganda. And fortunately, this particular propaganda is based on facts. It's based on science. And so I view teaching as a really essential tool to helping raise that next generation. And even if you're talking with a history major or a literature major, all of whom I allowed to take my ornithology class without prerequisites, those are among the most important people we can be teaching, because they're going to go out and become leaders in society. Just a quick note about connecting with audiences that we might not normally connect with. folks in the humanities, artists are great at disseminating important messages to society. We need to broaden our usual networks, not only to spread the word about evolution, but also to improve our careers. And then finally, in terms of funding, we've seen some very exciting foundations stepping up to the plate, places like the Templeton Foundation, the Simons Foundation. My only thought on these, it's very exciting on one hand, but their approach has been to sort of award a very few very large grants to a few select sort of marquee projects. I think if we can convince foundations to fill in, the best way they can fill in the stopfalls in funding is to spread the wealth broadly. You'll get way more bang for their buck funding graduate student projects than big marquee projects. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the symposium.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Emily Josephs.
I will share my screen. Share. Go and okay. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully, yes. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me, Gina, and for everyone here to listen. My goal today is just to talk about federal funding in the US. And so within that, I have a couple goals. My main one is just relates to cutting through all the swirl of information, or as Mohamed called it earlier, like it's so easy to fall into this pit of despair, because I've noticed this disconnect where when you talk to some people or open up social media or the news or read the headlines, like Pro mentioned, it can kind of feel like US science is just doomed, which is not great. But I've also heard other people say things like, oh, everything's fine. Grants are going out. Congress funded NSF last year. And so what gives? It seems like there's this big disconnect. And so my goal with this talk is to try to talk through and figure out what we can actually tell about what's happening and sort of highlight where you can go for information when you need it. Okay, and I should know that I'm not an expert. I'm just an associate professor in the US trying to run a lab, and certainly you should be talking to program officers and going to info sessions as well. Okay, so the good news about today, about science right now, is one thing is that there were GRFPs last year. These are super important grants for funding brand new graduate students. In 2025, there was a lull in funding, but this year they released the same number of awards as they've released previously. And many of those went to folks in biology, unlike some of us feared. And so that's really exciting and a piece of evidence that money is still coming out and supporting junior scientists. Some of the less good things that are happening, so funding in biological sciences and across all fields of science has been down at NSF. And I got most of this information at grantwitness.us, which is a really great resource if you want to actually see some concrete information about what's happening. And so what I want to highlight on this slide is that in 2025, there were about 2/3 as many grants as got funded as in previous years. And while we don't know for sure what's going to happen, there's been a lot of technicalities with how money is moving through the government. It does seem like we're on track to fund fewer things this year, although hopefully that will change. Okay. It's a similar story at NIH for folks who are NIH funded. This is just data from NIGMS. And you can see that in 2025, fewer grants were funded than in previous years. And a lot of this is related to this move towards multi-year funding, where despite the fact that the budget was level, they were able to fund fewer grants. And there's also been a lot of staffing issues across NSF and NIH, and Nature has had some nice reporting on this. NIH also released information itself just showing that funding rates dropped in 2025, including for early stage investigators. And so you can see here in 2025, they were much less likely to have their grants funded than in previous years. And so that's been a major impact across our field. For what's coming in the future, the Trump administration has proposed really steep cuts to NSF. This happened last year as well. Last year, then Congress funded NSF and NIH at its normal levels. This year so far, the House committee has proposed a less steep cut, but we're still waiting to see what happens in the Senate. So keep that in mind for going forward. Okay. Finally, a number of grants were canceled and then reinstated. That added to the swirl. I think a lot of us felt some of them have still been canceled, and grantwitness.us has a lot of information about the specific grants that were canceled, and they include grants in our field, not just grants in other fields. And so for folks who've had grants canceled, this has been a pretty catastrophic. Okay, so just to end, hopefully what I've highlighted in this really quick lightning talk is that the impacts in science have been really uneven. Things are not normal, but things aren't totally like everything isn't over. We're not in a horrible situation right now. Stuff is getting funded, but it's less than normal. And so some people are experiencing this in a very normal way, just like in COVID, many people experienced life as normal while others had huge effects. In this case, some folks are still getting grants, still running their labs like normal. Other people have had their grants canceled, or they're somewhere in the middle where they're an assistant professor who's would have normally gotten a grant funded, but it was in that sort of band that didn't get funded last year, and now their career is feeling much more precarious than it would otherwise. And so hopefully what I can impress upon you, and this echoes what lots of other people have said, just please listen to your junior colleagues and support them based on what they need and what experiences they've had. And so that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for listening and for having me here today. And I'm excited for the rest of the symposium.
Okay, next up is Alison Davis Rabosky, and we'll take questions at the end of Alison's talk. We'll have a big open Q&A.
All right, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Gina, for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about museums as a vehicle of hope. And when I say museums, I'm specifically talking about natural history collections, which I would argue are one of humanity's greatest and most aspirational experiments that we've ever run, where you literally have thousands of people who have collaborated across literally centuries and continents to create these expansive global repositories of preserved specimens, including fossils, that form time series data, and that they then make these resources available to scientists around the globe. And I have an asterisk here to clarify that it's not actually free. It's just that the costs aren't always visible to the user. And Emily just gave a really great example of all of the funding ecosystem that exists today, and collections depend on the exact same funding structures as all the rest of our field. And in my experience, a huge portion of museums personnel working across the globe are actually working on a volunteer basis. And unfortunately, this lack of resources and also a very complex history of colonialism does affect what access and opportunities are available for more reasons that I can fit into a 5-minute talk. But I would say overall, we who steward these collections all believe very deeply in this greatest of all experiments, and I think we have something positive to contribute to this moment. I think it's important to remember that each museum does not stand alone. Natural history collections are embedded within a giant consortium of more than 2,000 biodiversity collections, which are represented by red dots here. These are the collections that give data to GBIF. I would say we have a giant co-op model, right? There's big museums, small museums, local museums, global museums, and we all work together collectively to curate, study, and share more than 2 billion natural history specimens that form the basis for all biodiversity knowledge on the planet and underlie a huge amount of evolutionary biology research, I would say past, present, and future, that can help people today. This research can take almost unlimited forms. As a curator at a Museum of Zoology, I get asked all the time, like, what could you do with 2 billion specimens? And I have sort of two answers. I say we do things the original collectors never imagined could be possible with a specimen because technology changes through time and improves. And we do things that you would never do if they hadn't collected the actual voucher specimen. Photographs can't tell you what an organism ate or what their gene sequences were or what parasites, pathogens, or even heavy metals might be inside their body. And so each of these specimens really does form a time capsule. And when you multiply that by 2 billion across space and time, it's an incredibly important data set. And that's what allows you, when you have a series of these specimens, to test hypotheses about change in traits and their interactions across both time and space in a huge way that is impossible to do with just one person's career. And relevant to our discussion today, I think I would argue that specimen work can be incredibly affordable. There are lots of very high-profile papers that have been written with basically measurements taken with a set of calipers. And indeed, many specimens can be made in places that don't even have reliable electricity. And so if you're new to this idea of incorporating collections-based research into your own research program, I would say step number one is to explore the data landscape. Data aggregators like GBIF are a first stop to see what sorts of specimens are local to where you are, what are common in collections, what's rare, and in particular, what knowledge gaps you might be uniquely positioned to fill or questions to test. Step number two is to coordinate with curatorial teams. Again, some collections are well-resourced and some are not, and so bring your ideas to them and see what can be possible when you're working together. I would remind you all that these collections can facilitate evolutionary research across all timescales. It could be deep time comparative work like I do across the entire tree of life of snakes, but it could be more contemporary questions as well. And I would put in a plug for resurvey studies where you look at where collections have been done in the past and you specifically target those same sites to resurvey them. I think these can be incredibly important. This is a set of tumbling flower beetles that we recently digitized from Malaysia that are ripe for a resurvey study, as one example. And if you're still confused about what you might want to do, I would say go to the collection and ask. Every collection has needs, and sometimes really exciting new opportunities arise when you talk to people who understand their own collection strengths very well. And last, I would just encourage you to not limit yourself. Be creative. There are many, many, many ways your research could interface with collections. And I just want to end with a call to action to think about paying it forward and contributing to this co-op model by depositing some specimens of your own. Here I'm showing data from the University of Michigan Zoology Museum and also our herbarium, showing the decline in our collections through time. We may be a more extreme example than a lot of other museums, but uncomfortably, I would argue that our collection today in the 21st century looks a lot more like the 1800s than it looks like the 1900s. And so we are not in the peak of collection. I don't know any collection that really is, and I would argue that this is an opportunity for everybody to help. And indeed, this is a pattern that we see across taxonomic groups. It doesn't matter if we're talking about plants and fungi that I have here in green, vertebrates in tan, or invertebrates in blue. Whatever your taxonomic expertise happens to be, you have something to contribute. We can do amazing science today because people collected in the past, and that allows us to answer questions that require data sets that are far bigger than a single person's career. And I know that times are tough, but however bad they are now, even if they get better, they're going to get bad again. And so depositing specimens is one of those ways where you can reliably ensure that your work will benefit the scientists and society of the future because every specimen you deposit becomes future data. So this is one of the one thing that gives me the greatest hope in these uncertain times is that other people will join this greatest of all experiments and we can all be part of the change we would like to see for the future. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alison. That's wonderful. Okay, that's the end of our speaker lineup. And now we have an open floor for questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and then I will call on you and you will be unmuted.
And there's a question in the chat as well for.
Yeah, I can read it out right now. It's for Dr. Rabosky. Nice talk. How do you think recent legislation, CBD, Nagoya, and NAGPRA have influenced the drop in accessions at your collection?
That's a great question. So if those of you who are not familiar with Nagoya, this is an international benefits sharing agreement that encourages people to not do helicopter science and indeed make sure that the benefits that collections provide are equitable across especially the countries of origin. I think Nagoya has been a good thing to help people collect more ethically. There are lots of the United States is not a signatory to Nagoya, and so it certainly is not an explanation for why collections within our own country have declined. So it absolutely plays a role, but it is not the only driver. And I know there's a bunch more curators who are here on this call. So I encourage them to answer if they have a different perspective.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think Nagoya it's important, and it hasn't really stymied the scientific process. It's, as Alice said, it's really just making things more inclusive, and I think it'll force folks to have more engagement with stakeholders in different countries, and that's a good thing, and we shouldn't view it as a detriment or something to get around.
Great. Ruth has her hand up.
Thanks. Yes, thanks, Allison. I really appreciated your talk. I just wanted to give a shout out to a living collection that I had hoped to shoehorn into my talk, but failed. And that is the collection of seeds that's an NSF-funded project, Project Baseline, that gathered seeds from many species from across the US. It is limited to the US, but those seed collections are now available for request for doing evolutionary studies with allowing contemporaneous comparisons of plants from a decade ago with plants that are sampled, as you were saying, Allison, resampling from the same sites. So we're really hopeful. Julie Ederson led that. There were a number of others involved, many others involved, but those are really valuable collections for experimental studies going forward.
That's great. Amber, you have your hand up. Amber? I think you're muted. Okay, let's move to Emily Josephs, and then we'll come back to Amber. And then there's, Amber has her question in the chat. So, Jo, why don't you ask your question, and then I'll read Amber's question.
Okay. Also, Mercedes has a question in the chat. So
Thank you.
my question was for Ruth. I was thinking, like, ideally we would all get to read all the papers we wanted all the time in order to evaluate our colleagues. But we also don't have infinite time to do this. And I was wondering, are there things as a community we could do to better support our colleagues in getting evaluated fairly? Which is just an open question, because I would love to think about that.
Thanks, Emily. I really appreciate the question. One thing that in searches that is, I feel is relatively new, although one of my younger colleagues said it happened when she was hired 10 years ago, was that candidates are asked to identify three, say, of the papers, their own papers that they regard are as their most worthwhile, most important contributions. And so then members of search committees, at least, possibly also those in the department not on this, could choose from a paper, at least skim for a cogent sense of what it's about. That's not going to happen with the full list of applicants. I realize that, but once there is a long-ish short list, then I think that is realistic to use the guides of the candidates themselves to the papers they regard as their most important ones.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a question from Mercedes in the chat. It says, I find that our biomedical colleagues are often more discriminatory about biological subfields than the general public, and this impacts access to support and funding, especially of junior faculty in integrative biology departments. Any advice for talking to senior colleagues who perpetuate the silos that hold applied study as more important than evolutionary biology? I feel like this is an open question.
It is a real problem. I think you see the whole spectrum. For example, some molecular biology departments are actually hiring in the area of evolutionary biology. And so, but I think your point is well taken that and the bottom line is this is what happens when resources become limited. Folks form coalitions and they try to keep the bread for their community. And I think, as you suggest, just talking to them, showing how a lot of it's driven by the funding agencies and what their priorities are. And that's a tough one. I defer to my other colleagues about how to broaden that net. That's a very, very tough question.
I guess I might chime in. I began my career thinking of myself as a basic scientist, and I think I still feel very aligned with that. But as my career has advanced, it has really spoken to me the extent to which I find, and this is very much guided by my own students' interests, they've sort of opened my eyes to the ways in which our basic science really matters for practical applications in conservation, for example. And so I think making those connections, for all of us to be making those connections as we may, however we can with our colleagues who are not as aware, I think we can all play roles in doing that.
I have one answer from the museum perspective for biomedicine, and that's that, emerging infectious diseases are estimated to be about 2/3 to 3/4 zoonoses that are coming from wildlife or sometimes livestock. But if all you're doing is studying it once it's already made the jump to humans, you've missed 95% of the evolutionary history of that particular pathogen that could tell you a lot about patterns of spread and spillover risk. And so the most important thing you could be doing for infectious disease research is evolutionary biology in nature. And to me, that's been the most successful argument I've been able to make to my biomedical colleagues.
All right, and now we have a question from Amber. You should be able to unmute now.
Thank you. My question was about the public outreach and how we reach members of the public who aren't likely to attend museums or public lectures, and maybe themselves are no longer, in public schools or don't have kids in public schools. And I was wondering if Dr. Edwards' trip across the country on his bike might have given him some ideas of how we interact. How do we find ways to interact with people that we're unlikely to meet up with in these normal places?
I think it's a really, really great question. And it is difficult often for academics if they're in an urban environment to sort of get out there. I've seen graduate students do it as part of their fieldwork. They need to get access to farms or private lands, and they end up talking to the owners of those lands. That's a very good opportunity to just tell them what you're doing. And most importantly, to disabuse them of this idea that scientists are somehow weird or strange. They're just normal people taking their curiosity to the next level. You can also use things like local Audubon societies or Lions clubs or just sort of town councils. I've seen local naturalists have a lot of effect just in their local town, just using the sort of infrastructure of the town to bring an audience together. And so, yeah, it's the rural. I think the rural urban divide is one of the most profound in our country, and I think that we have to make extra efforts to engage that rural component.
Want to quickly weigh in to Amber's question, just to plug if you're going to the in-person meeting, one of our workshops on Saturday, June 20th is writing effective op-eds. I think there's probably still space for signing up for that. And so op-eds can be, to your local newspaper, can be a really wonderful way to communicate with the people that still read the newspapers. Although I will say that I have had interesting lack of response trying to write op-eds to Tennessee newspapers. So you might have a different uptick depending on where you're targeting in the country.
maybe I'll just add that for those of us at land grant institutions, there are experiment station outreach extension educators, and I have recently made connections to some of them who are just so grateful to learn about our science, and they are out in rural areas speaking with people who are hungry for the information at a level that the extension people are really trained to convey it.
Thank you.
It's great. There's a comment in the chat from Megan Duffy. For people who work on lakes, there's a group called Libraries Love Lakes that pairs school and public libraries with lake scientists. So that's a nice resource. I have a quick question for Ruth. Ruth, with some of the resources that you showed about DORA and the San Francisco agreement, do you know of any departments that have agreed to take any of these proclamations or decisions up? Or is this just individual researchers know of the resource there and will talk to their department about it? I'm kind of wondering if this is a potential recommendation that could come out of this virtual session is, read, discuss, decide as a department if you want to adhere to some of the suggestions in these different mechanisms of assessing scholarly work.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gina. In preparing my remarks, I sort of stumbled again on DORA. I had heard of it, but had forgotten. So, and then read much more in each of those websites and learned much more about how far advanced this is. And then by contacting scholars, friends in Europe, and also from the Navigating Publishing workshop yesterday, Canadian participants, I learned that in Europe and Canada, there is very intentional adoption of DORA principles. From asking around here in the US, so far, and this is not a systematic survey by any means, casual contact with people I know, but so far I have not encountered people who are closely familiar with DORA, certainly not in my department, Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota, but to just call it out, but also other universities in the US. So as I was saying, I think we're lagging behind. There are really valuable resources that are well developed that we can all draw on and advocate for within our departments and universities. Yes. Have study groups to read these papers over the summer.
And we've got a few more comments. For those who work on plants, local gardening clubs often have guest speakers. You could try reaching out to them. Another one is talking to the local Rotary Club can be another option. And then most recent comment, noting the 3 societies have a code of ethics for members that includes responsible conduct of research, including the handling of specimens, and a link to that code of ethics.
That's great. I have a quick question for Emily Josephs. So you mentioned in your talk that the funding that we've seen is pretty low for 2026, lower than expected, but you said it might change pretty soon. What did you mean by that?
Oh, I guess I just wanted to add that uncertainty. I'm not an expert. I didn't talk to anyone at NSF or NIH when I made this proposal or when I made this talk. But just reading the reporting that's come out in like Science and Nature and other sources, it seems like a lot of that lag at NSF was related to just technicalities for how money moves from OMB down to these agencies, and that had gotten resolved recently. So that was where I was getting that from that reporting. But I don't have any inside information. Other folks on the call might, and I wasn't able to attend the NSF, the the outreach event they had yesterday.
Thanks.
We've got a question in the chat and then also a raised hand. I could ask the question in the chat first. How will you support early career scientists such as master's and PhD graduates who are entering a complicated job market landscape? How can we maintain them as they move forward with their careers?
I can talk a little bit about it from the survey we have done. I think a lot of people have mentioned just acknowledging a lot of things are not within anyone's hands. Like the faculties cannot spend their own money, right? So just acknowledging, if you have seen your PhD student couldn't find a postdoc this year, maybe you can help them by keeping them in your lab as lab tech or something, some temporary position, and hopefully things gets better in few months. And once they find the position, at least they're not unemployed by that time. So those things, what we have heard from people, might be helpful. And also, a lot of people are thinking about leaving academia. So if they're trying to do that, you can, if you know somebody who has already left academia, you can connect them with your student and they can help you in that case.
Okay, and then we have Sam, you can ask your question.
Yeah, it's not a question. It's actually just a follow-up on what Emily was saying about NSF. So in a normal administration, even if the final budget isn't, doesn't come down until late in the spring, which has happened in recent years, program officers are authorized to start spending money early on. That just didn't happen this year for, we're not in a normal administration. And so I am sure that my colleague, now that they finally have been given approval, I'm sure that my colleagues at NSF are frantically trying to process as many of the awards that they've been holding from all the things that have been coming in. So I think you're going to see a real spurt in funding in the next month or so.
Awesome, thank you. And then we have a few more comments. According to what NSF folks said yesterday, they finally have a budget from OMB and are making awards. That's basically 6 months into the federal fiscal year, so they will likely disperse proportionately more funding in the second half of the fiscal year. And then another comment, there's a diverse careers workshop for PIs interested in supporting their students and postdocs later this afternoon.
I have a question for Sam, if that's okay. I'm curious to know if you mentioned, reach out to our representatives and our senators. Does it make sense to kind of continually reach out to them, or do drives, say, by different societies at particular times work best? Or should we just kind of be doing an all hands on deck approach?
It's a bit of everything. In part, it depends on who your congressperson is, what committees they are on. Obviously, if you have a senator or a congressperson who sits on a funding committee, the committee that funds NSF, they're going to take a different approach than if you don't. But all of them are worth time. Certainly, if any joint society action is good because they pay attention to numbers, right? So if, like ESA, the Ecological Society of America, has this Congress Day where they send a whole bunch of people to the Hill, and maybe they're only talking to staffers, but that's good. So that is, especially if, like through AIBS or something, some sort of collective action, that is good. But yeah, anytime, just keep it on the radar of your congressperson. Now, some of them, it may not be worth the effort. I actually, the where I'm now living in Virginia, we've got a hard right MAGA congressperson, but I met with his chief of staff. I made the pitch, and you just have to, you have to make the pitch in a way that's going to resonate with them. Like science produces jobs, and don't pitch for evolution or biology. You want to pitch for all of science, and just like fully fund NSF, fully fund NIH. Those are the best. Make the pitch simple and broad.
Great, thank you. Becky Fuller has a comment in the chat that says, one group who hasn't been mentioned are undergrads hoping to enter graduate school. And I wanted to second this because my son really wants to go to graduate school and he's graduating soon. I agree with her, it's rough times for them. So one thing I will say is that we've suggested that he takes a gap year, works as a tech, or just takes a year off and works if he can't get a grad position. But it is a real stressor for undergrads. Scott?
Yeah, I just had a comment. My colleague, Doug Emlin, some of you may know him. He's a professor at the University of Montana. And he has really risen to the task of reaching out to his Congress people. And it's also significant because he is engaging with a lot of rural communities. And so he's an excellent resource for many of the issues that we're talking about today.
That's great. Any other questions? Ruth says in the chat, even before our current time, I strongly endorse gap years before starting grad school. I took two. I took a gap year as well. Yeah. Pro, just really quickly, I'm curious. I know your responses for your survey were anonymous, and thank you for taking the time to do a nice survey. How many people did you have contributing to that?
We had 20 people for the anonymous survey. Then we asked if they're okay if we contact them for further interview, and 2 or 3 people I have interviewed for that.
Oh, great.
And among those
That's
20
wonderful.
people, we had around 9 grad students and 11 postdocs.
That's great. Yeah, I really appreciate the message of just acknowledging the issue, being upfront and open about it.
Yeah, in a lot of comments we just received, like, it's great to even start this conversation, which is really appreciated by everyone. So,
Yeah, that's actually a really important point. And because the truth is, many Americans are not aware that science is under siege. And so often, without trying to be polarizing or highly political, I will simply mention that this is a very difficult time for science when I give a seminar at a department. And you can do it in a non-confrontational way because many people are probably not aware of it.
Actually, what Scott just said makes me think about also, depending on what institution you're based at, I think the funding architecture to the public can be very confusing. And like, I'm closely aligned with a museum, and like, I think a lot of people think that the admission to the museum is what supports the funding, but that's not what happens. Like, we need, federal funding support and things like that. And so I think it's also important to be really transparent to the public, like where their money is going and why.
That's a great point. Emily?
Thanks. I just wanted to highlight one thing we've done here in my department and community that's been, I think, helpful is we went to the farmers market a couple of times last summer and set up a table just with some flyers that we got from Stand Up for Science and some letter writing replies. We have a Republican congressman representing us, and that felt helpful. I'm not sure how much those letters helped, but just seeing how many people in our broader community. So a lot of folks don't realize, like Scott said, that science is under siege, but they live in a college town and they care about it. And so sharing that information and giving people a way to act felt really good. Again, I imagine those letters went straight in the trash, but maybe they were helpful. I'm not sure. It hasn't seemed to have moved our congressman at all.
Ruth?
Just picking up on your point, Emily, I would just like to say there are other opportunities at farmers markets. About a decade ago, graduate students here at the University of Minnesota took the initiative to tabling at our local farmers markets to just present to the public a little vignette about the science done here. And then that really grew to soliciting many different labs across, into chemistry and so on, across the whole university. Our dean of biology supported it. It came to a crashing halt and it in it a number of times. And I think it would be wonderful if something like that could be started again. And yeah, I'd love to name the names of, but anyway, maybe enough said. I encourage others to try.
Right.
We have one comment in the chat. I've been doing a gap year for the past year after finishing my master's, but now I'm struggling to get back into research and finding PhD positions. Do you have any recommendations for that? And then one response is applying to eeb.info website with some tips. One helpful tip, unlike applying to undergrad, focus on who you want as a mentor before looking at the school itself, who's doing good work and seems ethical. Then we've got a comment from Pro. Just to add to Sam's comment, while talking to policymakers, it may be helpful to include some of the broader implications of the work. For example, instead of focusing only on specific biological findings, you could also frame how the results may inform conservation planning, invasive species management, public health preparedness, or long-term resource allocation decisions. That broader framing can make the relevance of the work more tangible for policy audiences. And then we have one more comment. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you, everyone. There were some great suggestions already, but I was wondering about getting more experience with outreach and science communication as a grad student in the US. My perception is that it's not viewed as a priority by programs and mostly happens by accident or through voluntary work. Does anyone have different experiences or suggestions on how this could be improved?
I mean, I don't know about other universities, but I think many biology programs are increasingly valuing science communication. And so I agree with you that it is often happenstance, but hopefully we all appreciate that science communication is extremely important. So, and maybe you can get credit some way towards your degree by taking a class in that area or something.
Ruth?
I thought I would mention a program at NSF that started just a few years ago. I hope it's still alive. Maybe Sam can help us here. It's called Intern, and it supports graduate students during their graduate student time. It is as a supplement to an existing grant, but it is for the graduate student to be able to work outside the university in an internship role. And one of my students, Amy Wananen, worked with Nature Conservancy sort of midway through her time. And I think that really has been so important for her in developing her skills, communicating in that realm. So.
Oh.
we've got a link to the intern program now in the chat. And some other grad school advice: keep your options open, don't fixate on one result, be flexible. And then another comment: one downside of gap years to be aware of: students with loans will have to begin repaying, which can be a substantial burden for those with more debt. For many of my students, as a consideration when it comes to deciding whether to go straight to grad school.
Pro?
Yeah, a question for Ruth. So do you know if the intern program, it helps you to get experience in industry jobs, or it can help you with science communication, outreach on those skills as well?
My understanding, but I'd send you to the solicitation, but my understanding is that it's a very broad range of possibilities where a student can do their internships. It's not limited to ecology and evolution kind of fields or behavior. And again, maybe Sam wants to chime in here.
Yeah,
but industry, I think, is also
yeah, we actually saw very few of these, just because uh, biologists don't think about, especially sort of ecology and evolution, people don't think about going into industry. But yeah, it couldn't be a bit of anything. And so, yeah, these are the kinds of things you should really try to tell your graduate students about, to think about, broad career options.
With that, I'll make a quick comment. Our next Evolution Exchange short videos, well, they're not short, but videos that I've been doing with people in the community, including Sam. Our next one is going to be about diverse careers, or getting a career outside of ecology and evolution. It's both a discussion of a survey of people who have gotten their PhDs in ecology and evolution and gone on to jobs in industry, and then practical ways that departments can help students find different sorts of positions in industry. And that's going to be discussing a program that we have here, or a symposium or sessions that we have here at Michigan called ECBAL, which is basically just a group of people that have lunch and then bring in outside speakers who have gotten their PhDs in the field and then gone on to different types of industry. So be on the lookout for that. It'll probably be out in the next week or so.
We've also got a few comments kind of about outreach as a grad student. Ask your faculty to create a course on science communication. You can check if your grad students have any outreach efforts ongoing that you could contribute to. Here in Canada, we have a grad student run program called Freed. And then my department asked all of the faculty to come up with a short activity or module that could be carried out with student groups that might visit campus or ask for an outreach speaker. I think it's good to have something ready to deploy so the time burden is shared amongst multiple groups.
Wonderful. I think we have kind of a lull in the questions. So sort of last call for questions before taking a break before the next session. Anyone? All right, well, just to quickly wrap up, I want to thank everyone for contributing to this session. So both the speakers who came up with 5-minute lightning talks, which are often more difficult than putting together longer research seminars. We really, really appreciate your time. And thank you for everyone who has joined us today. I also want to plug the next part 2 of the symposium, which is going to start at 11 a.m., led by a career coach. I'll be honest, I wanted to just kind of come up with a way to give everyone therapy for this moment, but I will acknowledge that it's not therapy. It is guided self-reflection and thinking about your career and personal resilience. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I hope to see you at 11 in the next session.
Thank you, Gina.
Okay, thank you.